If you already understand the exposure triangle just a little bit, but you're wondering what that plus minus button's about, you're not alone. This exact question I saw on the Facebook forum the other day, and let me read it word for word for you. I have a pretty good understanding of exposure. How and when does the plus minus exposure come into play? Is this a starting point, or is it just for fine tuning? Well, the comments that came from that, the answers that user got was, I use it all the time. I never use it, or put it in manual and don't worry about it. And we'll talk about how to use it in the real world. Let's start simple. Exposure compensation is just you telling the camera that you want the photo to be a little bit darker or a little bit brighter. That's it. The camera has a built-in light meter. That light meter is based on some basic assumptions. Everything should average to a middle gray. And if you start reading about that, it's 18% gray. We don't need to get too deep in that. It just wants to shoot for a middle tone of gray. And that works great for average scenes. But in the real world, when is it ever average? For example, snow isn't gray. Black dogs aren't gray. Sunsets and sunrises are not gray. Concert stages, ball fields are not gray. So when your camera is ready to take a photo and you look at the meter and it's set at 0, it doesn't mean it's the right exposure. It means it is the average exposure, and it may not be what you really want for that photo. Exposure compensation is for when you want to make it darker and you shift it to the left, or you want it brighter and you shift it to the right. Now you'll find this in a couple locations, especially the entry-level DSLRs and mirrorless cameras. You'll have a plus minus button on your camera somewhere, usually up on the top, maybe near the shutter button, but usually somewhere on the top. I think my XDI had it on the back. My Canon R5 and my Canon R6, it's not on the body, it's on the back screen. So I'll push the Q button on my R6 so that you can see the back of my screen and what it looks like. That's the only way I can get the exposure compensation. I can get to it through the menus, but the quick way to get to it for me is to push the Q button and navigate to the exposure compensation and adjust it from there. So if you start experimenting with exposure compensation, I beg you, I implore you to set it back to 0 once you're done playing with it. Because I guarantee you, if you do not do that, next time you pick up your camera, it will be set to what you were playing with, and you'll be wondering why your pictures are too dark or why they're too light. Okay, we've got the most important part down. Now let's talk about when exposure compensation actually works for you. Exposure compensation will only work in semi-automatic modes. What I mean by that, let's cross off automatic right off the bat. If you're in automatic mode, you probably don't need to deal with exposure compensation. And I don't even know if it works. I think it might work in some cameras and it may not in others. But let's just cross automatic off the list. The other mode it's not going to work in is if you're in full manual with ISO also in manual. It's set to a specific number. Why? Because you have 100% control. The camera has nothing it's allowed to adjust. So for exposure compensation to work, you have to tell the camera, like we said before, we're telling the camera, I want you to make it darker or lighter than what the camera thinks it should be. So let's talk about aperture priority. We're going to assume the ISO is in 100. So if the ISO 100, aperture priority, I set it to 5.6. What is it going to adjust? The only thing it has left to adjust is the shutter speed. And it's going to adjust the shutter speed to get the best exposure it thinks it can get. And like I said before, it's an average. So it's going to take an average exposure, and then there are some different metering modes that you can get into, but let's just talk basics here. So it's going to get the best exposure based on what you gave it. So now you can use exposure compensation. I'll give you an example here. Here's a picture of an airplane I took when I was out trying to shoot birds, but this small plane was flying by, and one at 0 and one at +1. The +1, you can see the underside of the wings and the belly of the plane. To 0, it is pretty dark. Why? Because the sky is what the camera saw, and it tried to expose for the sky, not for the small plane flying through the sky. So shutter priority, just like aperture priority, since you're setting the shutter speed, we have ISO on 100 still, the aperture is going to be adjusted by the camera. Again, if you want it darker or lighter, you use exposure compensation, and that is what the camera is going to adjust. We have a little bit more to cover, but for now, what have we talked about? We talked about exposure compensation, what it is, and when it will work and when it will not work. Now you can understand why some photographers say they never use it, because if they always shoot in manual, exposure compensation won't even work. Quick pause here. If this is clicking with you, resonating with you, I have a newsletter. Please sign up for it. It'll be in my description down below. I also have a blog. My email will get you to that blog that will have the long version of this written out for you. So check that out. All right, let's jump into some real world scenarios that you may come across. Snow, sandy beach, white walls, white background, something like that. The camera is going to try its hardest to get to that middle gray. And if it's all white, the white snow is not going to look too white. The white sand's not going to look good. Your white wall is going to look dirty. The answer? Increase your exposure compensation to +1 and take a photo and see what it looks like. You may have to go all the way up to +2 or some variation in between 1 and 2 or something just less than 1. Take some photos, look at your LCD, you decide what the right exposure should be. So another scenario is dark scenes where you got dark sky or a dark background. Maybe you're at a concert. If it's a dark background, the camera is going to try to increase the exposure to bring the background detail out. When it does that, it's going to blow out any faces that happen to be in the photo. So you may have to send exposure compensation to the negative side. So in that case, start at -1 and go up or down from there as you see fit. So for the sunset, you may have to dial down that exposure compensation to get it. In reality, maybe this will be a video for another day. I would do something called exposure bracketing, which does some automatic exposure compensation in both directions, and you stack them and you get everything exposed the way you want. One common mistake, we've already mentioned this, it's worth mentioning it again. So you go out to take photos of birds. So you set the exposure compensation to a +1 while you're taking photos of birds that are in the sky. Have an awesome shoot. You come back in the house and you try to take some photos of something that's interior and all your photos are overexposed. Well, you left it in +1 or +2 exposure compensation. You forgot to set it back. Make sure when you get done taking photos, whether you got a negative or a positive exposure compensation set, that you set it back to 0. Set it back to 0 so that your next photo shoot, you're not stuck at some exposure compensation extreme that's going to mess up your photo shoot. And so back to that question on the Facebook forum. Is the exposure compensation a starting point or a fine-tuning? It is actually neither. It is a bias. And what I mean by a bias is you're telling the camera, no matter what you think, I want you to be 2 stops brighter, 2 stops darker. Whichever direction you want to go. It's just a bias that you're informing the camera to apply to the photo you are taking. If you remember one thing, exposure compensation is you telling the camera, I don't want you to be average. I want you to be above average bright or above average dark. I want you to take care of that for me, but I'll give you the instructions how to do it. If this helped you, let me know down in the comments down below. Do you use all manual so it never applies to you? Or do you use aperture priority, shutter priority, and you didn't know about exposure compensation, but now you do? So leave me a comment down below. Remember, I have a newsletter. Also, make sure you subscribe to that. This is Doug Gabbard, practicing photography, getting better 1 photo at a time.